I was thinking this week, I do a lot of that thinking, and it's important for today's show. But we spend a half hour here, and after the show, we have a conversation and say, we could have spent a couple hours on this. Well, you know what? Just about everything we have spent any time on, people have spent lifetimes on. These are issues we're scratching the surface to the deep end. We're showing that there is a side of things that is so mysterious and so hopeful and exciting and frightening. And that's what we're doing today. Today we're doing a very simple thing. What is a thought? It's interesting. The first real understanding this guy comes up with the term engram, which is a memory trace. When you have a memory or a thought, it has a little trace in your brain, like a little comet, and that sets up in your brain. Now, that memory trace, that's changed over the year because of neuroscience, and that's where we have to begin our journey, at the place of neuroscience, which I will say right up front is one of the most complex sciences of all. Now, the fact is we're learning to map the brain. Where does a thought come from? Where is it? We're learning with different brain imaging tools, the fMRI, which is functional magnetic response imaging, which is real time. We can watch the brain. We can see what parts come into play at different things. Facial recognition, emotion, language. These are different types of thoughts, and we're beginning to see how they work. And, your arms and your legs and your head and all that stuff that you feel with, we're learning where those are. It's called the homunculus, which is the little man inside. And it's basically along the sides of our brain. It's all wired in there. We're learning to map the brain. But you see, in this whole process, we've unveiled a complexity. And I'll be honest, I've had a great time reading this week on this. And I came upon a piece by Elizabeth Daugherty out of MIT School of Engineering. And I'm just going to lay it out because she says it so beautifully. The human brain is composed of about 100 billion nerve cells, neurons, interconnected by trillions of connections called synapses. On average, each connection is about 1 time a second, but there are some specialized that go about 10,000 times a second, or 1,000 times a second, And this is producing thought. Now, given the complexity of what's happening, it's not easy to trace a thought from beginning to end. It's very difficult. For instance, when you hear these words, the vibrations associated with the patterns of the sounds, they hit your eardrum, and the energy triggers an electrical signal in in sound detecting cells there. The electrical signal propagates like a wave along threads along these axons, which are the long parts of these neurons. And when the signal reaches the end of an axon, it causes the release of what's called chemical neurotransmitters into the synapse. It's a chemical junction between an axon tip and the target neuron. Remember, there are 100 billion of these in your brain. A target neuron then responds with its own electrical signal, which in turn spreads to other neurons. Within a few hundred milliseconds, the signal has spread to billions of neurons in several dozen interconnected areas of your brain, and you have perceived these words. And the words have meaning, and each word is a thought, and those thoughts are strung together in sentences and paragraphs to create deeper meanings. This is a process that is amazing. And I'll be honest, if you think of these neurochemical reactions today as the new engram, it's somehow translated into an image, an idea, a thought, or some kind of representation. And that synapse between the chemistry and the brain imaging is an amazing piece that we really don't know. And so it really comes down to this. Is there this, I'm not going to say is there is a virtual space created by this neurological happenings. I mean, close your eyes and think of chair. If you're driving, don't do that. Now, where is the chair you see in your head? Now, I call this virtual place the soul. And that's where thoughts are. That's where all of this comes together. There is some interesting translation there between the chemistry and the image. And we don't really know what that is. As a matter of fact, a deeper question related, is the brain the source of these thoughts? Or is the brain merely creating a doorway to amplify something beyond itself? You see, thoughts, where they come from, now think about this. At each of those trillion interconnections, they are so small, if you measure them in angstroms, that they are open to quantum tunneling. So when we think of where a thought comes from and what a thought is, you know, we've got our experience, and there's some say it's all about our experience and it comes from there. Some say that there's insight that seems to come from outside of us. These thoughts, ideas, perception in this virtual matrix of profound complexity was created by these neurological interactions among trillions of interconnections of chemical processes. A thought. You know, we think every day you're listening to this, and all of this is happening in tiny, itty-bitty milliseconds, and it's the most amazing mystery that's happening all the time, and we don't think about it all the time unless it's your specialty. But we want all of our listeners to know that a thought is big, and it comes from something profoundly mysterious, and you are part of it. So I just kind of laid out a neurological thing. There's some bridge between the neurological and what I call the soul space, where the imaging, where the ideations, where the cognitions, and the imaging happens. We don't really know what that is. And although we can trace the chemistry of where a thought might come from, we don't really have a sense of what it is in its true, palpable self. Now, my friends, Bob Hayes is coming to us from Florida. Marianne Rudis is coming to us from Spokane Valley. I'm up here in South Hill in Spokane, Washington. And today, a thought. Marianne, I'll turn it over to you first. I just did my shotgun blast. What say you on a thought?
Founding thoughts on thought, because honestly, it's a lot. And I think everything that you just talked about, I don't know that it tells us where thoughts come from, but it tells us how they travel through in our brain. And for me, when I think about all of this, there's another piece to it of observing your thoughts. And so what kind of thought is that's observing your thought that you're having? And and I think I said this before we came on, that this is just a deep, complex thing. And I think I'm going to learn more today than I have to contribute, because it is, it's mysterious. And I think, you know, the act of observing your thoughts can lead you somewhere, but then it begs the question, who's doing the observing? And I don't know. So like I said, it's confounding.
Amen. Amen. Bob, what say you as our opening statement?
Well, this question, what is a thought, is one of the reasons why I started to study psychology. And at the beginning of my studies, I was totally confused. And at the end of my studies, after a couple of master's degrees and a PhD, I'm still pretty much confused. But I think that one of the things that you left out, or a couple of things you left out in your shotgun blast, is that you described what's happening with one neuron. What's really happening is billions of neurons are acting all at the same time. And what happens is that generates a field, an electrochemical field that exists within the brain, around the brain, and it's that total field that is the thought. So you can't isolate it to. That's why the idea of an engram is kind of a dead end, because there is no single place in the brain where a thought happens. A thought happens in the whole brain in this electrical field that is constantly changing based upon the pattern of all of these billions of neurons firing. And I think that the thing that allowed me to understand it a little better was to step back away from the neuroscience part of it, because, you know, I'll leave that to the neuroscience psychologist. And I looked to Carl Jung, who looked at it from the behavioral side. He studied people's behaviors and what happened when certain things in their experience caused them to have certain thought patterns. And that led him to developing his theory of complexes and how this energy, whatever it is that's causing these neurons to fire, the combination of what you're seeing out in the world and what you've experienced previous to that, causes this pattern of firing. And that sets up a unique pattern that fills in the thought that is generated by this energy that is coming, he believed, from the unconscious and ultimately from nature itself. So these complexes are coloring the way you experience the world and really giving you the background in which to label your thoughts.
Yeah, and that's a great context about the virtual space, but it doesn't really respond to what's the gap between the neuroscience and the virtual space where complexes and all this stuff can be perceived. And is there quantum tunneling? And is the brain just amplifying stuff and using all of that as a stepping stone into something new all the time? Again, evolution says, complexification, differentiation, and semi-permeability. It's trying to move somewhere. And those are the deeper questions for me, And I didn't mean to imply that at the beginning that the brain was sitting there waiting for a stimulus so it could create a memory trace, that the brain is a seething, trillion interconnection thing, and it's literally buzzing all the time. Even when you're sleeping, the brain can't not buzz. It can't not do that. If it does that, you won't breathe. If you do that, your heart won't beat. There's all kinds of stuff happening. At the level of thought, though, something is happening. And I think this is where the mystery to me is. Isn't the brain an amplifier or just a mishmash of its own experience that is putting things together in a new way? And how is this virtual space being created? Because, see, I think that's what The Matrix is all about, the movie series, is, our brains are creating a matrix. And I think the matrix is the soul. I really do. I think that humans have a soul. It's a virtual space created by chemical processes. So I guess go ahead, Bob.
I was going to say the problem with labeling it the soul, though, is you get all of that baggage that comes with that term.
You're right. But I'm trying to give a new definition of the soul, if you will, so we have some understandings that are based in something real and not just the belief stuff. So I guess that's why I'm using that word.
Yeah, no, I understand, and it's probably fine once you explain it to us. But for the average listener out there, they're not going to be able to bring that context with them when they hear that term.
Well, so, and I'm hoping that
I don't have a better term, by the way.
No,
I don't have a better way to define.
And I'm hoping that our listeners will begin to participate in a refreshing new understanding, and it's not really that new. Krishnamurti actually talks about this stuff, and Marianne, he's got a whole lot from the perspective of what you talked about is our own personal experience. He says we don't need to look in other people's brains and cut them open to do that. We can look at our own processes. Now, I will say this, he had an ability to see things that I clearly did not see, so he was very fine-tuned in that internal world. By the way, Krishnamurti is the guy that Joseph Campbell met on a ship sailing to England, and it changed his life in a way that moved him from what I would say religion to mythology, and that, thank God.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Mary Ann.
go. Oh, sorry, I thought I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think one thing that is clear is that there's a complexity going on here, and even each word, and as each one of you are speaking, I started to have thoughts about what you were saying, right? Because something gets triggered, and I like the idea of thinking of this in a field and patterns. And so once that so whatever patterns I have going on, what you say is going to trigger a certain thought in me, but what you say is going to trigger a different thought in someone else. And so I think that's where we get into, how do we use this? Do we have control over those patterns? And I think that's where Carl Jung and a lot of these thinkers, Krishnamurti, come in, because they're showing us that you can have some kind of control over these patterns. You can change the way that you're thinking. You can start to perceive in brand new ways. So to me, this is getting a little bit exciting.
Yeah, and you're bringing into, both of you, a different order of understanding of thought. And that's that it's not just happening in our brain, but right now we are 3 units synapsing with language. So we're now at the level of the global brain. And I talk a whole lot about the human family because you see, one is an analog of the other. What's happening in the brain is happening on the planet. We are a global brain. We are communicating with each other. The same thing is happening. So you can see how the bio-neurological chemical stuff creates images and feelings and all this stuff, but so does us talking to each other. Stories. I mean, talk about a synaptic happening. A good story takes something inside me and puts it inside you, and then it takes another journey. Around the water cooler the next day at work, you have a conversation about what you all saw on TV, and you each have a different take on it. It's welcome to the world.
And it's a numbers game, as we've talked about in a lot of different contexts. Your brain works in terms of the number and pattern of these neurons that are firing. And each neuron is firing based upon the extent to which it's stimulated. And it's an on-off mechanism, sort of like a computer. And the same thing is happening in society. When you get enough people thinking similar thoughts, then that causes a shift in the whole culture. And it becomes almost like an on-off switch. And so you're perfectly right when you talk about analogs. That's the essence of living systems theory, is that the same thing that's happening at all levels of systems is analogous to what's happening in any single level. So it's perfectly logical that the what's going on in the brain in terms of the patterns and the way things are generated is happening analogously in the society at large.
And Mary Ann's whole issue of change, can we exert our own change on the system? Now, I think we can. Hopefully it's not wretched and violent, which it seems to me a lot of the changes are. But I think one word I want to lift up for our listeners, and that's the word that both of you have used, it's patterns. The brain is a pattern of buzz, man. And, all I can say is Google fMRI live brain imaging, and you will see, they put a picture of somebody who's just been slaughtered, and we see what's part of the brain processes that. You show a picture of your wife and child, and we know what part of the brain comes into play. We're mapping it. It's quite amazing the way the brain has been divided up, and we know where emotions come from. We call it the reptile brain, which is back here, and the brain stem. Over and over, we're learning more and more. But the mystery of a thought, again, that gap. And Bob, you brought up the different ways. There's the neurological way of looking at it, which is chemistry, and there's the cognitive way of looking at it, which is the idea of ideas and thoughts and the power they have, complexes, those kinds of things. And, I go to Hofstadter's You Are a Strange Loop. Talks about how the self is built up to become something by one experience after the other. I continue to dance this dance, to be amazed by my own thinking, and to see that what is going on inside my head is more complex than any other thing we have seen in the universe. In my mind, the mind itself is the growing edge of the universe. You want to know, it's like someone said, the universe is indifferent, it doesn't care. And I said to them, well, do you care? And they said, yeah. And I said, well, maybe it just took the universe 13.7 billion years to care. You see, compassion, love, empathy, all these things have come online, and they're part of what the brain is translating. And that soul place, and again, I want you to see that the soul place is a virtual space. It's infinitely variable, omnidirectional. It has a budget ad infinitum. I mean, I've held battles with hundreds of thousands of people in my head. People say these new images from space are making them feel small. Well, and I've said this before, science has nothing to do with it. The whole world now is sharing the bigness of the universe. It's inside people's heads through a picture. And it makes you want to see another picture. This is the cool thing about being a human being and living in the mystery and allowing it to be out loud in your head. A thought. When we apply just a simple thought. Damn.
Well, and I think that kind of brings us right back to where do those thoughts actually come from? And I think that, I can listen and I can start to have thoughts. As soon as you mentioned the pictures of the universe, my mind went to a place of, I saw that picture, I saw the image in my mind. So I had a thought about how that was. And then it goes to a feeling. And so then how are feelings tied to thoughts? So, you're right. It is this huge, and then there is the part of me that is observing myself having the feeling because of that thought. And so that is a thought as well. So I think that where do they come from? That's a mystery. And I love that both of you have said, even with all the study you've done, it's still confusing. And so I don't feel so alone in that because it is confusing. But I think that, and there I go, I think, therefore I am, right?
Well, and when you talked about change, that's kind of stuck in my head, and I'm thinking about patterns. I think about the picture of the planet Earth, and I've said this before. I'm the first generation that's seen the Earth without geopolitical boundaries. Think about it. The planet we saw before that was in our classrooms in a globe. That picture, in my mind, went into our heads and created whole new patterns of thoughts. That, wait a minute, all the differences between us are provisional at very best. And we all are part of the same happening, which is one life system called planet Earth. And I'm hoping these pictures from space will have the same kind of effect on us, will help us change our pattern of thinking to see that we really are. I don't think we're alone, but we haven't met our neighbors yet. I think that this is all part of helping us understand that the human family, we're part of each other. And that this island planet we're on is a very special place that we need to see as a holy land. You don't need a God for this. You don't need all this belief system. We can see the sacred by living reality. If you see the sacred as that which creates life and sustains life and allows life to happen and grow, we are it. And this thought, a simple thought, is so complex. It is beyond amazing once we dare to engage it. And part of the deep end is we don't have the answers. We're given our best guess and say, hey, look at this. What about we think about it this way? The whole concept of the soul as a virtual place created by neurochemical reactions, that doesn't make that virtual space less real. It makes it a drawing board for the real, if I might say that.
Another aspect to make it even more complex is that this field of thoughts, however we're going to describe it, is constantly changing. And the thought we have in the morning may be very different than the thought we have in the afternoon.
I hope so.
because so much has changed, not just within us, but everywhere and everything around us. And that gets back to the idea of the Tao, of this thing that we can't identify, that underlies everything, that is moving through everything, that is changing everything. And our job is not to try and stop it and identify it at any given moment, but to flow with it. And that's where, when we have a thought, if we're in sync with the Tao, with goodness, with the million terms we could define it.
The root intent.
Then that leads us to certain behaviors. Thoughts and behaviors are intimately connected. And if we are at peace with this change that's happening around and through us and in sync with it, then our behaviors are going to be more in sync with, again, whatever the intent and impetus of the universe is.
Amen. We're at the point for our last comments. So, Mary Ann, last comments.
Good. Well, I was just going to say that thoughts create behaviors, but I think there's an emotion piece that's in there in between that helps us move that. But I think the whole idea that our thoughts are created in this field. And so how much control do we have over that field? I once saw an experiment of, when you put the same cells in different environments, they grow differently, right? And so how do we have control over cultivating the field within our own minds? And I think that's the task that comes from watching your thoughts, examining your thoughts, trying to figure out, how do I create a healthy field for my thoughts to create healthy behaviors? And so I think that's, And then we get into, is there an original thought? But anyway, I will just leave it at that because this has been very enlightening for me. So thank you both. I learned a lot. So.
Oh, dear. Bob, your final comments?
Okay, well, it's a difficult thing to think about. because it's so complicated. But I think that one of the things that occurred to me is I go back to the teachings of someone like Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who in his transcendental meditation dealt with thoughts, but only in the sense that you not hang on to them. You let them go. You don't get upset by them. You don't get too attached to them. You let them go, and you wait for the next one to come. And in the meantime, you exist. You just exist and let the thoughts come through you. And I think that if more people can get rid of those emotional bonds that Marianne was talking about a little bit, and let the thoughts flow, let them do what they will with us, then maybe we'll be in a better place.
Amen. And, you know, Marianne, to be honest, you're what you were talking about, great segue. Because here's the thing, thoughts give rise to behavior, behavior gives rise to thoughts, thoughts give rise to behavior, behavior gives rise to thoughts. You see, that's the flow. That's the flow. We can be stuck in it, or we can ride it with full intent. And that's the question that we're going to talk about next podcast. What is the intent of our willful change? All this stuff is happening, change is happening, and yet we know from, if you listen to these podcasts, that differentiation, complexification, semi-permeability, they're at work. Now, we know they're at work, and we can be part of that and put our own intent in that. And prayerfully, the intent has to do with empathy and compassion and love and all of these things like hope, imagination. You see, the stories we tell ourselves will allow us to have thoughts that will inspire us to constrict or to expand. What is it that causes us to expand? What can we participate in the willful change of the world? We better damn well try, because if we don't, we be toast. My friends, God's peace, and may the love of the Holy One be all over you.